Hey everyone, it is so great to have you here. First off, thanks to Code for America for hosting a summit that is focused on designing an equitable government together. We're super excited to be hosting this session where we'll be talking about a few things, some tech focused, but more importantly, we'll start off with tech, but then we'll get a little bit more into community collaboration, because that's part of what this summit is about, but more importantly, it's what our session is about as well. A couple of quick things. We want to keep this interactive, so drop comments, thoughts, ideas in the chat. And then if you look to the top right of your screen, there's like a session versus event section. Try to stay in the session area, and then if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A. So good morning / afternoon. I'm from the East Coast and I'm in New York. Great to have you all here, and we're gonna get kickstarted. So today's session is called Data by the People for the People. And we're gonna talk a little bit about how transit agencies are using data for equity. We'll start off talking a little bit about tech, but then we're gonna jump into an actual real use case scenario. And we're gonna focus less on tech then and a little bit more on co-design and community collaboration, which are all critical to having successful outcomes and equitable outcomes. With that being said, I wanna introduce who's gonna be on this panel or conversation with me today. I'll start quickly with myself. My name is Taisha O'Brien. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the founder of Consensus. We are a cloud-based platform used by government agencies to get representative data through public engagement and community insights. I'm actually gonna pass the mic to one of my co-presenters, Brooke, to introduce themselves as well.
Thanks, Taisha. Hi, everyone. My name is Brooks. I use she, her pronouns. I'm really excited to be here. And I'm a co-founder and managing partner of Reflex Design Collective. And we help mission-driven institutions like government agencies partner with the communities they're trying to serve to collaborate towards equitable solutions. I'm going to pass the mic to Paige.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you all here today. My name is Paige Miller. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm manager at the San Francisco County Transportation Authority, San Francisco's congestion management agency.
Awesome. And so we're super excited to present a little bit more about this topic. And then we're actually gonna get into a real life use case and give examples of how community collaboration and co-design led to the design and future of an potential equitable policy that's being worked on. So with that being said, this is our agenda. This is all about conversation. So we wanna make sure that we're learning, we're sharing, and we're interacting. We will have time at the end for Q&A, but what we really prefer to do is to answer your questions real time. So please drop questions as they come into that Q&A section on the session. We're also gonna have a moment where we ask someone from the crowd to join us up on the virtual stage, so we can actually interact and play around with a digital tool that was created and utilized to collaborate with communities. So we definitely want this to be interactive. Please drop comments in. And we want to make this something that is exciting and engaging for you all here today. So to get us started, or I'm sorry, Paige, did you want to have a quick note on this?
Yeah, one of the projects that we'll be talking a lot about today, which is the concept of congestion pricing, which is a policy that charges fee to drive downtown during busy hours. This tactic has kept traffic moving in other cities like London and Stockholm, and now San Francisco is considering whether it could be a policy that can help our city.
So we're gonna start, I guess, kind of with a macro overview of just some of the work that Consensus does. So this is actually a picture of me and a couple of former Consensus team members back about a year and a half ago, maybe a little bit more than that. I mentioned we have a tech platform that a lot of government agencies use, but before we ever launched that platform, we spent 2 years going across the country doing community engagement, whether it was in the Bay Area, in Kansas City, in various parts of New York City. Our goal was really to have conversations with communities to understand when it comes to public engagement, what would be the best ways to engage and have conversations with them? All with the goal of trying to say, hey, how do we get the data that we need to make more equitable policies in the future? It's gonna come from the people who live in these communities, but how do they want to be engaged, and how do we make this more accessible? So we did everything you can think of: online surveys, giant Jenga games where we actually wrote on the Jenga pieces different elements of a community, and they had to strategically choose what could stay and what wouldn't. And we also tried out text messaging. And through that, over the course of 18 months, we ended up learning that text messaging is one of the most scalable and accessible ways to engage the public, because they're able to communicate easily, simply, and give their feedback on a particular policy, program, or initiative. And then we can actually turn those responses and the feedback from people into data visualizations and analytics, which is supportive for a lot of government teams working on significant projects. So from that learning, we actually developed a series of principles, which we kind of put together and call data by the people for the people. And if you want to tweet about it or throw it on social media, we put it together as the hashtag DBP4P. This concept, data by the people for the people, is really about going beyond what we typically think about data. You normally think, oh, it's data, it's numbers, it's stats. Our team at CoSensus does not see data that way at all. We see data as people. We often forget that when you're collecting information, it comes from human beings and everyday individuals who have thoughts, opinions, feelings, all kinds of behaviors, and they live in certain conditions. So we want to take the fact that everyone focuses on the numbers out of it and really focus on the people. And in order to do that, we've come up with these 3 principles, and these are the principles we actually use to kind of design what our platform looks like. And they're focused on co-design, collect, and co-modeling. And you'll hear a lot about co-design today, but the way we kind of define that on our team is about collaboration with communities. Before you even go into the process of designing a survey or trying to get data, what collaboration, what trust building, and what listening has your team or agency done with the public? Because that's going to be critical to getting some of the answers that you need. So it's really about fostering trust. What methods have you utilized for that? And that's a lot of what we'll talk about today. When we go into collect, what equitable systems have you implemented or maybe tried to implement to collect data? I think everyone's go-to is online surveys. I think about online surveys make up about 80% of all surveys, actually. And this is a great tool. It's fast and it works. But if you're thinking about a major city, in most major cities, about a quarter of the population may not have access to broadband internet at home. So how are those people impacted by the inability to get access to your survey? In addition to that, there are survey platforms that don't necessarily work with screen readers. So how are you ensuring that people who are visually impaired also get access to the survey? These are things you should all be thinking about with your team. So making sure that when you're collecting the data, that process is also equitable. And the last part is co-modeling. So if there are any people who are CTOs, software engineers, definitely drop your name really quick down in our chat. Would love to connect with you. This co-modeling aspect is really about the work that you do as a data analyst, data scientist, engineer, what have you. When you collect your information and your data, you often have it in your database or your backend system. And then it has to get categorized and labeled so it can get fed into some type of data set, data model, some type of structure or system. What often happens is the team who is labeling the data is very, very, very rarely the team who is actually giving the data, which means that we have community members giving us data and information that is very important, but then we have people who work in, a completely separate office and may even be disjointed from this community, categorizing and labeling that data. And one of the things we think about a lot at CoSensus, especially because of this principle, is how do we get more community members actually doing the work of and collaborating with us to label that data? How do we get them engaged in a process of categorizing the information they gave us? So our data and our models, and even if we think bigger, our algorithms, do not skew towards the opinions of the data scientists in the room, but they actually make sense based on the information that the community members gave us. So this is a really critical principle on the tech side, especially because there's tools like, AWS Ground Truth and all of those that are great, but we want community members to give us the feedback on their information directly. So co-design, collect, and co-model, the three principles we're looking at when it comes to this concept. And when we talk about consensus, we've kind of built this and integrated this into our actual platform. So this is a little bit of what consensus looks like. We have a text message survey that you can launch to engage the community. You'll see that on the left side of the screen. And then when people are responding to the surveys, real time, that data gets imported into our platform, and you get access to data visualizations that represent people's responses. So on the right, you'll see one of our features, which is an Esri integration that tells you where people are geographically located who are responding for your survey. And then one of the final things we do is, because the voice of the community is the biggest thing we care about, our mission is empowering community voices. We utilize natural language processing to really allow you to get to see from a macro standpoint what people are saying in their survey responses. So now you have the ability to kind of like tap and quickly go in and see if people are talking about congestion fees or bridge tolls. What are they saying about those things? This gives you the context that you really need when it comes to getting information to design policies or to design programs or initiatives. I saw a couple of people mention focus groups. Absolutely, that's a great tool as well. So I'm gonna actually pass the mic to Paige now, who's gonna talk a little bit more about a specific use case, and we're gonna start diving into that.
Great, thanks, Taisha. So our congestion pricing study that we launched has 4 main goals that we determined with the community and with a policy committee that we've brought on that's based on community members. And those 4 goals are getting traffic moving, increasing safety, cleaning the air, and advancing equity. Next slide, please. Thanks. And to expand a little more on that 4th goal of advancing equity, we want to recognize that face value, congestion pricing could be a regressive policy. However, we're working with historically underinvested communities, including San Francisco's communities of concern, highlighted in purple on this map, to understand whether and how discounts and exemptions could protect low-income travelers from that fee to drive downtown. And beyond that, we're asking, how could we advance equity in our transportation system from the program to benefit historically underinvested communities, given that communities of concern have historically been excluded from and often harmed by the planning process. Our project team is working to invite these communities to be collaborators with us on the study. And we brought on Brooke and her colleagues at Reflex Design Collective to help us lead this study from a foundation of equity. Next slide, thank you. And then here's our project timeline. We completed our first round of outreach for the study in step 3, and we're about to launch a second major round of outreach as part of step 5. Today, we will share our outreach approach and learnings to date, including, of course, due to shelter in place.
All right, thanks, Paige. And I'll pick it up from here to dig a little bit deeper into how we were able to set up this study for success in terms of working towards equity. And we can just click through to the next slide. Because the way that we approach this is thinking about like what actually is the root of inequity, right? Like we have policies and programs and services that either don't adequately serve or actively harm marginalized communities, people of color, low-income folks, right? But the process often that leads to that point are processes where these communities don't have a lot of power, a lot of influence, a lot of say. People's perspectives about what their needs are not coming up. And generally, you'll find like an inequitable process is leading to these inequitable outcomes. And so for this study, we really wanted to do something different and actually co-design the study process, the study findings, and the outcomes with communities by building partnership. Next slide, please. Thanks. And so what this looks like for us is, first of all, making sure we're focusing on lifting up the lived experience that people have. You know, it's even if you're very well-meaning and you care a lot about equity, like if you don't have a lived experience in somebody's neighborhood, then you're not going to know the details of what it's like to live there on the ground. And it's really important to center that lived expertise next to the technical expertise that a lot of the planners have. I also wanted to address that social context that I was talking about, who tends to be marginalized within planning processes that leads to inequitable outcomes. And for us, the root of it really is moving away from this kind of top-down model of planning where a small group of people are kind of in charge of what's happening and actually sharing power about throughout the process in terms of large decisions, but also the small design decisions that get made of, you know, what are we even considering on the table? How do we negotiate different trade-offs, right? And then overall, enter the folks who are most impacted in planning processes. And so the way that we approached this is first by building relationships with folks, reaching out to community leaders, having one-on-one conversations about the fact that, like, hey, we're having a study. We want to know how this might be able to serve your priorities as a community member. And then moving from those relationships into partnerships with community-based organizations to host a series of co-design workshops. We are actually at the table with folks designing different aspects of potential congestion pricing policies that may or may not work for people, and playing with some of those questions that technical designers often play with in the background without necessarily consulting the community every step of the way. Next one, please. And in terms of sharing power, I do want to note that the relationship building and the co-design workshops were a really key piece, but that in of itself also needed another layer of collaborative power, which we built into the study's policy advisory committee. And this was the body that Paige was mentioning earlier, where we had representatives from different stakeholders in the city, including leaders from communities of color, low-income communities, disabled folks, representing on this committee where they were actually giving consultation on the study approach, the process, and then voting democratically at various milestones about whether it was okay or not to move forward with certain things. And so we had a kind of consensus-based gradients of agreement process with this other mechanism called an equity flag, where if any one person had a concern about a decision related to equity, they could kind of raise that flag. It wasn't a literal physical flag, but like, you know, like raise a metaphorical flag. And that would actually pause the process until we could work with that person and resolve their equity concern. And that was a really important mechanism for us to have, given that community-based organizations tend to be super busy, and it tends to be really hard for folks to attend meetings like this outside of the normal course of their day. So we wanted to make sure that those barriers did not become a problem to having the type of power we wanted folks to have. Next one, please. So I'm gonna get a little bit more into what the co-creation workshops look like. This is screenshots from a card game that we were actually playing with folks during our first round of co-creation for what could potential congestion pricing policies look like. And we're actually going to demo this with a willing volunteer in a few minutes. But just to give a quick overview, we actually had folks play with the trade-offs that planners are often thinking about by choosing from a set of cards that would set a fee level for different income groups, and then actually choosing from sets of cards that would either indicate discounts or exemptions for different groups, and also investments that you could do with the revenue raised from the fee. And we had folks collect tokens based on the fee they chose, and then they would spend them on the discounts, exemptions, and investments. So you could like actually play with the relationship between those things, and people could prioritize based on what they felt was most appropriate. Next one, please.
we have a couple of questions actually about the equity flag from Jess Sand. So Brooke, was there a example that you have of when the equity flag was raised?
Yeah, it happened once, but I don't remember exactly what it was. Do you remember, Paige?
It had something to do with the technical analysis that we're doing and ensuring that it was equitable. But it was so long ago. It was actually an in-person meeting, if that helps you understand how long ago it was. So yeah, I can think on that a little bit more and see if I can remember later in the session.
Yeah, thanks, Paige. Because for context, folks, we started this study back in 2019, and we've been adapting throughout the pandemic, which is also something we're going to talk about. And so, just as a quick overview, the study is ongoing, and we're about to roll into our second round of co-creation workshops. But just through the first round, we were able to have more than 20 workshops. Over half of them were in languages other than English. We had almost 160 participants from what the technical term that we use is communities of concern. Not a perfect term, but it's basically talking about marginalized folks, people of color, low-income folks. And you know, the conversations were so deep and so rich, and we got really insightful feedback. And what was interesting is that folks who had participated in this process were more interested in the idea of congestion pricing than folks who had just kind of read about it, right? So that was cool. Next slide. But one thing that we had to negotiate in the middle of starting our first round of co-creation was the pandemic. So the Rona came in after we had maybe done a third of the workshops we had planned. And so the first thing we did was turn to our community partnerships and consult with the Policy Advisory Committee and some of our community partner organizations who were interested in continuing on. And so we focused on a strategy of, okay, like how can we continue to center accessibility to this process while negotiating social distancing? Next slide, please. Yeah, because, you know, we wanted to make sure that our process wasn't yet another thing that was exacerbated by the pandemic in terms of inequity, because obviously there are a lot of things impacted by that. Next one, please. And so our primary model moving forward after the pandemic hit was actually a remote co-creation model. And so we still had the interactive workshops using a Zoom platform, but we wanted to be cognizant of the difficulties with screens, different people's learning styles, as well as the fact that not everybody could video chat in because not everybody has that kind of internet technology. And so we actually mailed like physical copies of the card game and a packet that had all of the information and all of the visuals to people's houses so they could follow along whether they were calling in or not. And next slide, please. And just to emphasize that we really were following the lead of our community partner organizations. There was still a little bit of in-person co-design happening, and this workshop was actually a hybrid model where you had one person zooming in and then some folks in person, socially distanced, working through the activities, and it was great. And so I see a lot of folks interested in like playbook and applications, so this is a good time for the demo, I think.
Ooh. So here's the card game. We would love to have someone from the audience actually test that out. Maybe a couple of people actually. So there is a blue button that you have that allows you to request to join us on the stage. So if you're interested in testing out the card game, hit that button so we can bring you up and test it out. Oh, we have one person. We have another person. Hello.
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 Hi.
All right, so we've got J.I. and Manasa, is that me saying your names right?
Mansa.
Mansa, thank you. I can only see part of it. So, all right. So this is great. We are going to kind of do it how we did it with community groups and have you two actually talk to each other a little bit about which things to pick. But what we wanted to invite people to do is to start with the first set of cards at the top, which are about the fee level. And so these fee levels are calibrated based on income groups. So like, for example, the first one would be $10 for like moderate income folks or higher, $5 for low income, and $5 for very low income. And then there's another model below where the moderate and higher are paying 12, but then very low are paying 0. So there are a couple of different configurations here, and then they yield a certain number of tokens that then can be used on investments and also can cover different discounts and exemptions for other groups in addition to the price tiers that you see here. And so it's possible to change this. You're not locked in as soon as you picked one, but what price levels do y'all want to start with?
I'll go with the middle one.
Cool.
We'll just go.
I'll go with the last one.
Okay, so between the middle one and the last one, can you two share a little bit about your thinking? Because we've got to pick one to start with.
Oh, yeah.
I think I just gravitated to the middle one almost like not a lot of rational thought, more of just like responding to what I'm looking at, and I'm seeing lower prices. So just kind of, that's what triggered in my head, and that's what I went for.
Cool.
Yeah, I think I might have misread the second option. I thought it was 0 for, I didn't realize it's 0 for very low incomes in both. I thought it was only for the lower one, but that's why I went for the last one.
Okay, cool. So thanks for sharing that. That was something really important for you, that $0 for very low income. And this is kind of, these are the conversations where we were kind of taking notes and learning from people when they would mention things like that, as folks would negotiate with each other about which options do we want to coalesce around as a group for today. All right, so let's move from that. And it is also possible to pick no fee. But let's go with the $12 option now. And now you all can pick from the second set of discounts and exemptions for what other, who else is either going to pay a reduced fee or no fee at all. And I guess I can talk through the different options. So discounts for drivers with disabilities, free transit for very low income drivers, or free transit for very low income riders. So not so much related to the fee level of congestion pricing itself, but for public transportation. And then discounted public transportation for even more low income riders. So including more people in that. A discount for anybody who lives inside the congestion pricing zone, which for context in San Francisco is some low-income communities of color and also some very wealthy people. Then there's also maximum daily charge. So like having a cap at the number of times you would have to pay based on if you're driving back and forth. And then a discount if you've already paid to drive across the Bay Bridge into the city.
And we can only select one.
You can select as many as you want, and then it will tell you how many tokens you need in order to use how many tokens you have.
Lots of options here.
Yeah, I think I would definitely go with the one which is reduced number of people. I think it was the third one from the top. Discounted transit for more low-income riders.
Great.
And I think free transit, there was an option for free transit for low-income riders is. Can I
Free transit.
I think it's at the top. Yep.
Oh, here you go.
Yeah, very low-income riders. I think these two would be my highest priority.
Cool. And J.I., what would you add to that?
I was interested in the discounts for people within the residential zone if and only if it was like matched with an incentive or discount for transit for low-income riders. So had I only picked two, I would have picked, I think, the free transit with the zone resident driver discounts.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So that would, again, be something that we would write down and capture as like, this is the essence of, you know, the decision making.
So let's go down to the bottom and look at some of the investments.
I think we're already out of tokens. And so this is one thing where you start to get a feel for the limitations of the policy. But some of the things that folks were looking at were transit improvements, adding more school buses, pedestrian and bicycle safety upgrades is a very popular one. It was like the second most popular thing after public transit investment. Transit ambassadors, which are unarmed folks who can help support safety on transportation, improved paratransit for folks with disabilities. And we also had an option for folks to add their own when people were playing this in person before it was adapted from the co-creation workshops into a digital version. And so are there any of these you would want to add?
Right, well, preferably all of them, right? But I think that's the brilliance of the activity. It forces you to, puts you in the shoes of having to think in terms of trade-offs. I love this. I think personally, it just makes sense to me to invest in infrastructure, and I would want to invest in transit improvements.
Mm-hmm.
I'd agree. I think this is a great game. I've been working on school transportation a lot, and I see the difficulty that school children face in accessing transit. So maybe I'd go with the school bus option, adding more school buses.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm sure we could have a much longer conversation about all of these things. But now, so if you see on the left-hand side, there is the cost versus revenue balance. And the revenues are the number of tokens that we have, and the costs are what we've chosen to invest in based on either like the actual investments or the discounts and exemptions. And one thing to note is that it's not all about money, the way we built this in here. It's also about congestion pricing as a policy only working if enough people are paying it, right? Otherwise, traffic isn't reduced and these benefits don't happen. There's air pollution, etc. So, you know, if you exempt more folks for equity reasons, which makes a lot of sense, then you have to make sure that enough people are still paying it for it to function. And so at this point, folks can go back up to the top and say, do you want to raise the fee? Do you want to choose few things? I don't know if you all have any thoughts on that. We're going to probably wrap this up in a couple minutes, but yeah.
Wow, yeah, no, it really makes you have to think as a policymaker. Suddenly I'm like thinking about, all right, here are all the stakeholders. How would they be affected if I take one of these things out? What do you think, Mansa?
This is a really tough one. So the total cost needs to come down, right? Is my understanding right? It needs to be under 10, is it?
Well, so the cost, the fee needs to align with the amount of discounts
Revenue,
and revenues. So you can go back up and choose a higher fee and you get more tokens, or you can take away some of these things.
Right.
I think maybe then remove one of the discounts for the lower income folks, which is the tough decision to make, I guess. I think what JI picked in the beginning was a good option with like the middle one. So maybe we can remove one out of the two first cards that I picked. So like the discounts for more low income or discounts for very low income.
Okay.
Agreed.
Cool. So just for the sake of today, why don't we take away the one that's showing here already, the discount in transit for more low-income riders? And now we're almost in alignment, so we could either raise the fee for additional token or take one more thing away. And you'll also notice that on the left-hand panel, it tells you how many tokens each thing is costing. So the school buses would do it if you wanted to let go of that. And
in theory, we could get rid of transit improvements and say invest both in school buses and something else that only costs us one cost.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and so now we're back within the budget of this game.
Yeah.
So nice job. Thank you so much for working through that. And I want to recognize that this is very difficult because a lot of these things listed here are things that are very necessary for people to get through their day and to support them in survival, right? So it's almost a bigger conversation than just congestion pricing, and we're making sure we're learning like what do people need and how can we address that in different creative ways.
This is a great game.
Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah.
Thanks. Paige or Taisha, do you want to add anything before we move on to the demo?
I'm good.
Cool. All right.
Thank you. Thank you to the guys for joining. That was awesome.
So we did that, and then I think Paige dropped a link in the chat for folks if you want to play with it on your own. Feel free to do that. I'm going to pass it back to Paige to talk about other feedback tools.
Thanks, Brooke. Thanks for that demo. Yeah, it was great working to do that game that we call Unclog Fog City, both in our in-person co-creation meetings and also online with the community, and to some additional feedback tools. So the co-creation workshops that Brooke had mentioned, we did about 20 of those, both virtual and in person, with stakeholders across the city and some regional. And we were about to reach, it's a really like touch that we do with all of these people. And given that, we were able to reach about 160 people total. So of course, from our agency perspective, we need to get, in addition to that in-depth, more like focus group, like level outreach, we wanted to do, provide some opportunity public, the greater public, to get involved. So one of those opportunities was the game that Brooke just guided you through online. And additional tools included an SMS survey that we did with CoCensus, lots of virtual public meetings with community groups from across the city. And next slide, please. And so how did we get the word out about those tools that I just shared? So we used posters, in-language advertisements, earned media, social media, and more. And I did want to dive a little bit further into the texting survey. If we go to the next slide, please. And so we saw that we had about a little over 1,000 responses to that game that Brooke just walked us through. And when we looked at the zip codes of people taking it, we found some gaps. And also, speaking to a bit of what Taisha was mentioning earlier, we realized that not everybody has the technical ability to do an online game like that. So we were so lucky to get connected with CoCensus and then we looked online where we had those gaps in our zip codes, and we posted in those neighborhoods with a QR code for the online survey and with the texting survey. And we had about 300 people take that survey, which was great. It's about a third of the people who took the online survey. So what was different between our respondents of the online survey and the texting survey was the online survey only had about 1% of survey takers to language, and about 20% of the texting responses were in language, which was huge. And just as a note too, co-creation also gave us about a 50% in language participation rate. So we really see the value of different tools and reaching different communities. shelter-in-place situation. So we'll definitely be using all of these tools again in our second round of outreach that's coming up in round 2, and taking some lessons learned from our first round to make them even better. Great. And then we just wanted to talk about some lessons learned after this whole experience that we just went through during the first round of outreach. And the first one is co-design. We've talked about it a lot today. And the co-design approach really allowed for in-depth exploration and more nuanced feedback. So the co-creation workshops allowed participants to dive into the concept of congestion pricing and learn about the trade-offs and benefits. And it's actually why we think we saw more support for people were able to design their own program, either through co-creation or through the online card game, as opposed to other outreach mechanisms like community presentations. We still had about 25% of co-creation participants who didn't like the idea of congestion pricing. And through our conversations with them, we learned a lot, and we're iterating, and we'll be bringing up a second round of ideas in this next round, and we'll see how what people's reactions are. And another note about co-creation is that it's a heavier lift. It requires more time and effort to coordinate, whether it was in person or virtual. But overall, we believe, it's the right thing to do because you're bringing on the community as a partner, and it happens to work better in a lot of ways. And a crucial part of this was compensating our community organization partners and the participants in the co-creation workshops. We really wanted to value their time and efforts and the expertise and knowledge that they brought to the table. And it also helped ensure that we had participants in attendance at our workshops.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think it can't be stated enough how critical our community partnerships are with these community-based organizations. A lot of them are folks who are providing direct services, job training, all different kinds of things. There actually is one organization in San Francisco, the South of Market Community Action Network, that has a planning practice. But for the most part, these folks are doing the work of community building, serving people, building trust, and bringing folks together, without which it just would not be possible. And we feel so grateful that they were willing to work with us on this project. And so the next slide is just a shout out to these CBO partners to make sure that we give them their flowers here for the work that they've done with us, but also the amazing work that they do in general.
Is this one me? This might be me. Oh, okay, there we go.
Sorry there. So our budget was also important. We knew from the beginning that we needed to ask both for a lot of our own staff and consultant time from the get-go. And in our case, we had our core team, which is a pretty small team at the agency, and as well as consultants from Reflex Design Collective, Co-Consensus, Civic Edge. We had a pretty big consultant team here, and outreach constituted about half of our project budget.
I think one huge element to this that we really want to highlight is community members deserve to be compensated for their lived experience. They are taking the time out to share information that is critical to the success of the program with you. So that was mentioned earlier by Paige, but we just want to highlight that again. In this particular study, co-designers, co-hosts were compensated for their collaboration in the study. And then on the other side of that, when the tech survey was launched with Consensus, there was a raffle included to ensure that there's an opportunity for you to get compensated for your survey responses. So this is a really critical component, and it's a question I often get from a lot of Consensus customers. Should we, so we highly encourage that you build this into the budget when you're considering public engagement opportunities. And I think to kind of add on to that, your timeline has to really reflect your commitment to equitable engagement. I think quite a few people mentioned it in the chat, like this is an involved process. I'm sure by now you all realize that this process involved technology, it involved workshops, listening sessions. This was really an omni-channel approach, and that's what in part made it equitable, because there were so many different tools used that you can't apply the same method and hope that, you know, it works historically the same way maybe some of your old practices work. That means your timeline has to really understand and extend, and your timeline has to really reflect the fact that this process may take longer, and your results may not come in the same fashion or timeline that you really originally thought, or maybe that has worked in the past. So really build that out into your schedule, so you really can build this out as something that's successful, especially if it's a first time initiative, because you want to continue doing processes like these in the future.
Yeah, and just to add that I think we're really proud to be able to do that, the work we've been able to do. And it's important to also hold the fact that there's still a long way to go in moving towards like equitable planning processes in general, basically, right? Some things that we weren't able to do, if you think about, we started the project having already decided like congestion pricing is the thing that we're looking at. And that has to do with politics, that has to do with funding priorities that are not necessarily set in conversation with communities, right? And so it can create this difficult position where a lot of folks have been down to partner with us on this, but if they hadn't agreed to do that, then it still would have been moving forward, but just without their perspectives, right? So it's not a completely like fair choice or position to put them in. And it's really important to remember that even though we're very committed to equity, that work has to do with realigning institutions that historically have not been built to serve folks. And so we've just got to keep finding ways to work around that and evolve so we can break those patterns from the past. And so, yeah, we've come a long way, but there's still a long way to go. This doesn't solve the complexity of planning problems, as a lot of you I've noticed in the chat were starting to comment when we were doing the game demo of like, there's the scarcity mindset, and why are people having to choose between these things? And the other thing is that logistically, it's not ideal to be needing to partner with community-based organizations kind of on a project-by-project basis. And, you know, there haven't necessarily been opportunities for investment into like, what do ongoing relationships look like in general? How do we invest in like overall partnerships that could kick in different projects, but are more on the terms of community organizations and their schedules and their needs. So lots of things to explore going forward.
So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because we have a lot of questions coming in and a good amount of conversations happening, and we have about 12 minutes left. So I know there's a few questions. I think I just want to tap into one really quick. I think Rashawn asked specifically about analytics and being biased, or if I'm assuming the question was, how can we ensure the data isn't biased? On the end of consensus, there's two things we kind of play around with in terms of that. One is that when it comes to our surveys that are launched, we actually review survey questions first, and we co-design those questions with our government agencies who we're working with. There's a couple of things we're looking for there, but one of them are any types of racial bias, confirmation bias. I mean, there's a lot of different types of biases when it comes to data. So I think that's the big thing that we're looking for. The other thing we also encourage is looking at quota-based methodologies instead of just sample size. So you're looking at more representative data from a demographic standpoint, but then also looking at getting the right amount of survey responses with regards to honoring a margin of error, because data can be skewed. So if you build that out and you know those numbers in advance, that can kind of prevent a little bit of that in a sense. I think we have another question. We have a lot of questions. So another question we had is, I'll start from the top. How did you actually create public comment sessions with good, diverse attendance and engagement? So many government initiatives post public comments as a formality and only a very small privileged group gets to attend? Question.
Yeah. I think by public comment sessions, you mean co-creation workshops. And the reason that worked is because we had our community-based organizations partners co-host it with us. That was the only reason it happened, because of the community building work that folks are already doing. And they were down to kind of extend the relationships that they have in the community to us to co-host these things.
Another question is, how did you come up with the point system for the game? That's also a question I had.
Take that one. We worked closely with our planners to figure out, how much we were projecting rate in revenue, and then also how much different things would cost.
Okay. How do you balance the political priorities at play in this work? Has there ever been instances where it was hard to get community partners on board with what community members recommended?
I don't think that has really come up so far. I think it's important to note that the study is ongoing, and we're going into a second round of co-creation right now and a second round of general outreach. But the way that we kind of approach these conversations was having people work towards a collaborative idea, just so we can learn enough about everybody's different perspectives and kind of collect and synthesize those, and then share it back with our policy advisory committee, which is kind of our version of having community representatives help interpret what the data means. So right now it feels kind of like a both and we're trying to move forward with what those insights mean. But it might come up in the future, I think. But what would you say, Paige?
I would say from the start, our board, that's comprised of the Board of Supervisors for San Francisco, they asked us to lead the study with equity. So a big part of this process for us has also been transparency and the outreach and engagement process. So in co-creation sessions, we take notes during them and we compiled them for this first round of outreach into a big synthesis, which I can share the link to in the chat. And we share that with our policy committee, and the policy committee meetings are public. So everybody's really part of the conversation and able to listen and feedback. And we are following the goals that we started with at the beginning of our study. So that's also been helpful.
Kind of related to that question, how did you work with your agency's leadership to ensure that they were really bought in? Because I know you said that they said they wanted to do it with equity, but then when you had the plan laid out and said, okay, this is what it will take, how did you get them to buy into that part with the implementation and so on?
Yeah, I would say we did the co-creation process with Brooke and her colleagues at Reflex Design Collective for a one neighborhood prior. So that's where we really kind of used our training wheels and figured out, what is this co-design process? How does it work and what does it take? And a lot of that for us was about sharing power. And we knew from the very beginning that in order to do an equitable process for this study, we would need to set up the study so that we would be partnering with community members. I think that was really crucial. And we also learned through that process that compensating community members was important. So being able to kind of take our learnings from the pilot process and then set up the study in a similar way, even though for a lot of us, traditional outreach is different and often doesn't share power as much. So it required us taking on additional risk, and we had less control over the study process and outcome. But in the end, this iterative and collaborative process has resulted in, I would say, a linear yet more effective and meaningful process for us.
That's good. I think another question in here was about the crowdsourcing data and what are the equity justice risks of doing that. I will just highlight that in our experience, crowdsourcing data should be the way to go, right? Like the should be about getting the community's input as much as possible. So you can really design with them in mind. So the more data that comes from the community that the policy or program will impact, the better. Thinking about, and I know this was mentioned in the chat earlier, like the loudest voice in the room. One of the things we implemented on the back end of consensus is you can only fill out a survey once. If you try to complete it again, that data set or that bit of data kind of gets knocked out. So the response you have is coming from one individual. So you can't have somebody trying to skew the data by completing a survey multiple times. That allows us to get every individual's voice, or as many individuals as possible, into the data set that you're collecting. There's a lot of questions about a playbook for the game. Do you have one? Is there one available for people to kind of tap into?
Not a playbook exactly. I can talk about the process. We work closely with SFCTA to design this game, and like Paige says, the planners. And in terms of like the user experience of it, we kind of draw from this practice we call equity design to come up with stuff like that, where we take tools from human-centered design / design thinking and put an equity lens on it. So we make sure we're addressing social context, make sure people are, reflecting on the positionality of who is playing, and making sure that it's something where it involves sharing power. And so that's kind of like the inspiration and the skill set we use to kind of scaffold things like that.
Awesome. And then there's another question here from Lucy. How have you gone about ensuring that the work and ideas of co-designers are publicly attributed in communications about the project? It's a good question.
Yeah, I would say, so even just now earlier in the deck, Brooke shared the co-designers and organizations that we partnered with. And also in that synthesis link that I shared in the chat, we list every community-based organization that we worked with. And we do include, we really, when we report on our outreach efforts, we really focus on the co-creation aspect and the CBO partners. I don't know if you want to add anything, Brooke.
Nope.
Cool. Another question we got was on quota-based systems or methodologies. How do you approach asking demographic questions without making participants uncomfortable? So I think this is a really good question. There's two things. One thing at Consensus, we try to think about ways that you can avoid asking demographic questions. We do that two ways. One, we can ask them technically, but we really discourage it. We try to think of other ways to get people's, get people engaged in a survey. And at the end of a survey, potentially, depending on what the survey is about, we will say, hey, maybe we can ask these demographic questions, but you have people opt in. It's not required for every single survey response. And I know then the question becomes, well, how do you know if you're getting the right representative data? So that's when we look a lot at in-language responses. And also one of the things we're looking at in the next few months, we did add an Esri integration. And that's a great way, like having a zip code is a great way of understanding how many people from a respective community you are able to engage to then look at the demographics of that community. One of the things I learned doing a lot of community engagement over the past decade is once you start getting into demographics questions, people start backing away because they feel like their personal or sensitive information is being taken. That's tied to another question we had about collecting email or IP address. No IP addresses are taken. In fact, all of the survey responses are anonymous, so you don't even get the survey respondents' phone numbers. That's encrypted on the back end, so we don't even get to see it. It's all about ensuring that people feel safe and comfortable with the engagement, and that they don't feel like their personal information is taken. And at the end of it, if they want to opt in to give their email address or phone number, they can. So that's kind of how we've tackled a couple of those things. Cool. I think those were all of the questions we had. Oh, one more just popped in. How do you ensure people don't fill out multiple surveys without IP? That's because the phone number is encrypted on the back end of our platform. The encryption, each phone number gets an individual encryption ID. that it is coded with in our database. So when we see that unique encryption ID come in again, we end up telling people that you can't fill out the survey again, or we've already collected your responses. So that's kind of how we've managed to mitigate that. Paige, Brooke, any final comments? We're basically at time.
Just thank you for moderating this, Taija, and inviting us to participate. And anybody who has other questions, please feel free to reach out, and I'll put my email in the chat.
Yeah.
Thank you, Taija, and thanks everyone for joining. It's been great reading your questions, and would love to keep the conversation going if you want to connect.
Yeah, please check out the game from SFCTA. Please check out Reflex Design. Paige, Brooke, thank you so much. Code for America, everybody in the audience, thank you for spending your time with us. We hope you enjoy the rest of the summit today. Bye.